The past 2 seasons of this series has explored how the book of Genesis describes humanity's relation to God, to all of reality that speaks to us. The account of Adam and Eve is about how every human being relates to reality as a whole, thus to God. The accounts of their fall, then Cain's murder of Abel, and then the Great Flood are about how humanity can and do fail in this relationship in an increasingly catastrophic way. But the life story of Abraham and Sarah describes how God may yet personally speak with human individuals and be the guiding voice of their lives. The life stories of their descendants, Isaac, then Jacob, then Joseph, then describes how their family, through multiple generations, can journey further in that relationship from that initial meeting. And that journey is characterized by the name Israel, those who wrestle with God. But human beings are social beings. We live in relation to each other within a particular society and culture. We are not only persons, but a people. So how does a people come to relate to God that speaks with them personally? What does their journey look like, and how do they together wrestle with God? What sorts of things happen? What kinds of persons will lead them? What kind of relationship will they form, and what kind of society and culture will emerge from it all? These are the questions that we'll explore this season through the story of Moses and the Israelites' exodus from Egypt. So, welcome to the 4th season of What Do You Mean God Speaks?, where we explore important ideas, insights, and stories in Christianity for the skeptics who want to understand religion, to the Christians who have questions about their own beliefs, and everyone in between. I am Paul Seung-ho-jung, the author of God at the Crossroads of Worldviews, and this is our first episode of the 4th season, Who Were They Before They Became Israel? C.S. Lewis, arguably the most significant Christian apologist in the last 100 years, called the gospel story of Jesus the myth that became fact. Now, to understand what he means, we need to first return way back to season 2 of this series, to its 7th episode titled, Is Genesis Mythical? We explore then how scholars use the term myth to describe the genre of the book of Genesis, especially its first 11 chapters that recount the creation of the world, the Garden of Eden, Cain's murder of Abel, the Great Flood, and the Tower of Babel. However, the word myth here does not mean that these are some sort of superstitious false belief. What these scholars mean, rather, is that these are foundational stories that express some core beliefs about ourselves and the world, truths regarding reality, the structures of this world, humanity, and the like. Furthermore, a myth in this sense is not just any story that expresses these truths in some way, but a kind of crystallization of every story that does so, an ultimate summary, so to speak. So the Genesis account of how Adam and his wife ate the forbidden fruit in the garden is not just a story of what the first human beings did, but a story of every human being becoming alienated from God, thus from reality and from each other. The story of Cain and Abel is not just about one man, Cain, murdering his brother, but about every murder. Likewise, the Genesis account of creation is the sum of every story that we have and will tell about the cosmos, any kind of cosmos, and how it comes into existence, whether the story is being told in the campfires of the Stone Ages, or by science professors in a lecture hall today, or even by extraterrestrials in their spaceships. A myth is the sum of stories that tell a particular truth. And it is this genre of myth that profoundly influenced C.S. Lewis and his eventual conversion from atheism to Christianity. According to Lewis, even as an atheist, he was fascinated by ancient myths of many different cultures, by their compelling imagination and imagery, and by an almost inexpressible sense of wonder they seemed to rouse in him. But he didn't think that these stories were true. Then, his friends like Hugo Dyson and J.R.R. Tolkien, yes, Tolkien, as in the author of The Lord of the Rings, he was a fellow Oxford professor and a devout Christian and a Catholic. and they convinced them otherwise. They suggested that Lewis was drawn to these myths because they expressed something profound and true to humanity's deepest experiences and longings. Now, one particular kind of myth has especially gripped Lewis even when he was an atheist, the story of the dying and rising god. These myths, such as that of the Egyptian god Osiris or the Norse god Balder, features a god who represents goodness, light, and life, who is then killed, often by deception and betrayal, by some evil power, and this plummets the world into a catastrophe. But after a period of darkness and strife, the dead god returns to life, bringing back peace to the world. Now, I would say that these stories express a deep, timeless truth, an overall pattern of our history, so to speak, which is, although what is good and just and true is far too often rejected, betrayed, or even killed, making our world that much worse, in the end, this goodness will win out, or rather, that is what we hope. Our ancestors long ago may even have felt this hope and experienced this truth symbolically in the coming of winter and its months of long dark nights, then the return of light and life in the spring every year. But then Lewis was told that this truth or this hope became factually true in the story of Jesus Christ, killed on the cross, then rising to life. At least he did, according to Christianity. Myths such as Osiris or Balder are stories that are set in some primordial imaginary time and place, a kind of timeless everywhere and everywhen. The story of Jesus, in contrast, is set in a particular historical time and place, 2,000 years ago in the land of Judea, ruled by a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. Every historian today, other than a thoroughly discredited fringe group, says that there really was a historical person named Jesus who lived and taught in that time and place and was called by the title of Christ or the Messiah. Of course, skeptics can readily reject the content of what Christians have believed about this man, such as him being the Son of God, or the Logos of God, that is, God speaking all of reality that became a single human being, or that this man rose back to life on the third day after his crucifixion. But even these skeptics cannot so easily deny that these beliefs are about a real historical person, at least if they follow the evidence. According to scholarly analysis, the Gospels in the Christian Bible, which describe the life, death, and the resurrection of this man, were written fairly soon after the events they describe, with the Gospel of Mark written around 40 years afterwards, and the Gospel of John, supposedly the latest, by the end of the 1st century. And even those are only the final versions that we are reading today, as it is clear that these Gospels were put together from older, already well-established accounts. Then there are the letters of the Apostle Paul, dated to have been written within 20 to 30 years after the time of Jesus, and a couple of these letters even go as far as naming the actual eyewitnesses to the death and the resurrection of Jesus. And the early dating and Paul's authorship of these particular letters are undisputed among historians. Moreover, there are also historical accounts written by non-Christians around the end of the 1st century, such as one by a Roman historian Tacitus and another by a Jewish historian Josephus. Both accounts separately report that there was a man who was called the Messiah or Christ who lived and taught in Judea and won over many people. They both report that he was executed by crucifixion under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, but his followers, who would later be called Christians, continued to believe in him and spread far and wide afterwards. Tacitus' account is especially interesting because he was actually disparaging of Christians, saying that they were just superstitious lowlifes. Josephus, on the other hand, remains more neutral, even as he provides more details, like Jesus being known for doing quote-unquote startling deeds. Or rather, his account would be neutral if we were to subtract the parts that scholars now suspect were edited in by later Christian scribes, such as where he flat out says that Jesus is the Messiah, rather than his typical neutral stance that this is what his disciples believe. By the way, if you hear someone dismiss any historical accounts of Jesus outside the Bible as Christian forgery, this is what they're likely talking about. Though if they do that, check if they mention Tacitus, or how most historians conclude that Josephus' account of Jesus still has its authentic core, just with Christian additions. If they don't, well, that should tell you much about their credibility. Anyway, this is why for C.S. Lewis, the Gospel of Jesus is thus a myth that became fact. It is a mythical story of the dying and rising God, everything it means and more, presenting an eternal, timeless truth about ourselves and reality, but it's still unfolded in a particular time and place in human history. If we were to put it in the terms of how this series has explored these kinds of ideas, it would be something like the following. The person who speaks the truth and does what is good is the closest analogy to God that speaks all of reality. They are the voice of God for their generation. Yet we have often rejected and even killed such a voice. Yet the voice of God cannot be silenced. No matter how great the power of evil, of lies, of hatred and violence, the power of peace and life, of truth, of goodness, will return and save the world, and so God still speaks. That truth, that pattern, is what was realized and imaginatively told through the myth of the dying and rising God. But for Christians, that myth became actual literal fact in the historical person of Jesus Christ. But maybe you've been asking all this while, wait, isn't this episode about Moses and the Exodus? Yes. My point is that not just the story of Jesus, but much of the entire Christian Bible and the life stories of the people there are to differing degrees myths that are also history. I say differing degrees because on the one end is the Gospel of Jesus, a story of cosmic mythical scope that is nevertheless factual history, or so Christians believe, and it is at least based on an extensively confirmed historical person. The other end seems to be the Genesis accounts of primeval history regarding creation, the fall, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. And somewhere in the middle are the life stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Moses. Their stories are mythical in the sense that they describe some larger pattern, some core truths about how human individuals and family, and then a people at all times and everywhere are to relate personally to reality as a whole, that is, God that speaks with them, and what then happens in their lives. But they are also presented as people who lived in a particular time and place. However, the account of their lives lack the extent of historical confirmation that scholars today have regarding the person of Jesus. To use the wording of C.S. Lewis, the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and now Moses are myth that may be fact. They may be fact because there are tantalizing bits in history that we've discovered so far that may correspond to what the Bible reports about Moses and the ancient Israelites' exodus out of Egypt. But there is nothing that quite fits, at least enough to convince most historians today. One of the most significant difficulties we have is that the book of Exodus in the Bible, in its present written form, which details the journey of Moses and the Israelites, were put together around 2,500 years ago, at least as far as scholars can tell today. This is again around 800 years or more after the events it describes. Remember again how the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus, in contrast, were put together in its current form within just 40 to 70 years afterwards. But we'll have to leave the issue of historicity for now and return to it near the end of the season, after we explore the Exodus account itself that describes the journey the ancient Israelites undertook out of their slavery in Egypt. That's because we first want to learn what the story actually is, what it has to say about how an entire people come to relate to God that speaks with them, what happens in their lives, and what kind of things they come to wrestle with. We want to understand the insights and the ideas this account presents us. For until we do so, we simply cannot know what it is that we are exactly trying to connect with actual history, or what that would even mean. Our third season ended with Jacob, who God had named Israel, meaning the one who wrestles with God, taking his entire extended family composed of his grown children and grandchildren and their retinue down to Egypt. There they were met by his son, Joseph, who by the guidance of God was leading that nation through a severe famine. Israel died there, and his body was taken back to the land of Canaan to be buried in his family tomb with his first wife Leah, his parents Isaac and Rebekah, and his grandparents Abraham and Sarah. But his descendants, who would be called by his name Israel, remained in Egypt. The book of Exodus reports that several generations later, a new king, probably from a new dynasty, came to rule Egypt. The new king did not know nor care what Joseph did and was hostile to foreigners living in this land. So his royal court convened and turned their attention to a particular foreign ethnic group in their nation, the descendants of Jacob, called the Israelites. Jacob's group had numbered 70 in all when they arrived in Egypt, but several generations later, the generation of Jacob's great-grandchildren, according to Exodus, their number had grown to such an extent that they posed a security risk for his nation. At this rate, there will be too many of them, his court concluded, and in the event of war, they may join our enemies or escape our rule. So the new king of Egypt instituted two policies. First, these foreigners were to be put into strict servitude to the state. They were to be employed in the nation's many building projects, making bricks and raising up cities. Second, the state would impose a form of population control. Simply put, they would periodically kill a number of male infants born to these people to ensure that their numbers wouldn't grow beyond their control. Male infants, because it would primarily be the men who will take up arms or incite violence in the case of insurrection or war. Now, if I may say so, these policies seem to be a kind of time-honored practice of humanity. We've already repeated this story of mass slavery and population control many times over, even in the last few centuries right here in North America, such as what happened with the First Nations or the mass African slavery. In fact, it seems to be going on today with new methods, according to the UN report of the ongoing Uyghur genocide by the Chinese Communist government. So since 2014, Turkic Muslim minorities in the Xinjiang province in China, mostly Uyghur, but also Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and others, have been detained en masse, supposedly for re-education purposes. The official reason given by the Chinese government for this policy is again the imminent threat of violent insurrection and terrorism in that province by these ethnic groups. But the reports submitted to the UN detail forced labor, suppression of religious practices, brainwashing, and this is where genocide comes in, forced sterilization, and forced abortion. So it seems that neither our advanced technology and science nor our modern, supposedly enlightened secular governments have changed our societies much from the time of Exodus. Anyway, what was different back then was that there was no readily available method of mass sterilization or abortion. So instead, the Egyptian ruler gave this following command to two Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. When you are called in to help the Hebrew woman give birth, only let the female babies live and kill every male baby at birth. But Exodus reports that these women were devout believers of God. Now remember the first episode of season 3. For the ancients, to say that one believed in God meant the same thing as firmly believing that there was a kind of higher moral order, a greater truth and reality than even the highest human power, which in this case was the king of Egypt. And so, the two Hebrew midwives became one of the earliest known examples of civil disobedience, and they let the boys live. Then they reported to the Egyptians that Hebrew women were giving birth without their help. According to Exodus, God then granted these midwives family lines of their own because of what they did. So, the Egyptian government resorted to a more brute force measure. Everyone in Egypt was now commanded to throw every Hebrew male newborn they find into the river Nile. And it was at this time, during this periodic enforced population control, that a male Hebrew baby who would later be known as Moses was born. I am now going to go against what I just said earlier and consider some historical findings that may possibly connect with this portion of the Exodus account. But this is only to give a cultural and historical context of what may be going on. The earliest extra-biblical appearance of the name Israel that we've found so far is in an inscription carved into a stone stele in Egypt around 1208 BC, which lists the names of the peoples and nations that a pharaoh named Mernata boasts of defeating in his many military campaigns. Israel is among those names as a people group inhabiting the land of Canaan or the Levant, which tells us that by this time, Egypt considered Israel as a distinct and significant enough force to engage in a military campaign and then boast about it. It is also around this time, according to recent archaeological findings, that a large number of towns and villages appeared on the highlands of southern Levant. Archaeologists believe that these were ancient Israelite settlements because the inhabitants there seem to have shunned eating pork and did not decorate their pottery with graven images, both of which are very distinct and different from the other people groups that lived around them. As for the reason why these two traits are important, well, that's for a later episode of this season. The catch is, so far, archaeologists have found no sign of major invasion or mass foreign migration around these settlements that is in this region during this particular time period. So, majority of historians today have concluded that these people, who they believe were ancient Israelites, had always been living there before, that they were mostly Canaanites and not a new group of people who arrived from Egypt. But then the obvious problem is that before this time period, people living in this land did eat pork and decorated their pottery and household items with images, not to mention that there were significantly fewer villages in this particular highland regions before their appearance. So what explains those? What historians propose is that around this time, there was some kind of radical cultural transformation and local movements of population into the highlands. But if so, what caused that? And then there's a problem that, according again to historical findings, it seems that at least by the time that these people, these Israelites, formed their own kingdoms nearly 3,000 years ago, they themselves were saying that their ancestors were brought out of slavery from Egypt. But how did that belief arise? And this is why majority of historians also think that at least some of the ancient inhabitants of these highland settlements were the people described in the book of Exodus. But then who are those people? Were they the true Israelites? Or are we missing something? We can only speculate. One time period that has traditionally caught the attention of historians in the past is what is called the Hyksos expulsion from ancient Egypt. The Hyksos were Asiatics or Semitic people from the Levant who had moved into the northern region of Egypt around the Nile Delta and eventually established a dynasty there. They ruled a large portion of Egypt for about 100 years, from about 1650 BC to 1550 BC, before being driven out by a pharaoh named Amose, who would then go on to form a new united Egyptian dynasty. And it seems that before this period, the Hyksos rulers coexisted with the Egyptians to the south, but after being driven out, the Egyptians increasingly depicted them as savage, violent, and oppressive foreigners. Some historians have speculated that this expulsion of foreign rulers, the Hyksos, were the basis of the story of Exodus. But again, it does not quite fit. After all, Exodus is a story of slaves escaping from Egypt, not rulers with armies being driven out of it. What we can say, though, is that the cultural mindset of Egyptians during this period does resemble what the book of Exodus describes: deep distrust and hostility to foreigners, and specifically the Semitic people from the Levant, and that is exactly what the Israelites would have been to Egypt. But the Hyksos period only presents a possible historical or cultural context to how Egypt behaved in the story of Exodus. But are there something more? Again, we are interested in who Israelites may have been before they became, well, the Israelites as historians and archaeologists today describe them. Or perhaps we can put it this way: whoever or whatever it was that brought about this quote-unquote transformation of culture in the highlands of the Levant. And there is one tantalizing group that contemporary archaeology has discovered. The ancient Egyptians called them the Shasu of Yahoo. The Shasu were Semitic-speaking pastoral nomads, tent-dwelling people organized into tribes who herded animals like sheep, goats, or cows for a living, and they lived in southern Levant during the 2nd millennium BC. You may have noticed how that description fits quite well with how Genesis portrays Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. According to Egyptian records from that time period, the Shasu were often formidable enemies, and there was even an extended period in which these tribes, along with the various forces of Apiru, we'll get to them in a few minutes, wrested control over the Levant away from Egypt, greatly endangering the Canaanite city-states there. Among these Shasu were the Shasu of Yao, a name found in Egyptian records, one dating from the 14th century BC and the other from the 13th century BC, which is 100 or so years before the appearance of the name Israel in the Egyptian Myrnata stele. This has caught the attention and I suppose the imagination of a number of historians because the word Yahoo indicates a name, and the Egyptian hieroglyphics precisely match the letters of one very special name in Hebrew, Yahoo or YHW. Those are the letters, by the way, of the Hebrew name of God, God with a capital G, Yahweh. You know this name in English as Jehovah or Lord, Lord, all capitalized. It is the name which God speaks to Moses later in the Exodus accounts, and we'll explore that in a few episodes. But for now, the significance of these Egyptian records is obvious. They describe some tribes of pastoral nomads living in a way very similar to the biblical ancestors of the people of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and living around that time period even. And they seem to be called by the very name of God that Moses learns in the Bible. I say they seem because it's not conclusive. What we have so far is only a name, presumably that of God, which is spelt the same. Furthermore, there is not much beyond this that connects this Shasu of Yahoo to the Israelites, especially because Egyptians describe the Shasu as a diverse tribes of nomads, while later in the Myrnata stele, they depict the Israelites as a single settled people group in the hill lands of Canaan, wearing different things even. But then again, what if this only means that Israelites were a particular group among the Shasu of Yahoo, who had recently settled down in that region, and that is why the Egyptians depicted them that way? Yet again, we don't know. We can only speculate. Now, we've been saying Israelites, but have you noticed that throughout this series so far, we have been switching back and forth between the terms Hebrew and the Israelites and even Jews as if they mean the same thing. And that's because they do to a large extent. Hebrew is the language of the Israelites, and so the Christian Old Testament or the Jewish Tanakh is also called the Hebrew Bible because it's, written in Hebrew. But among the historians, the word Hebrew is also the name of an ethnic people, mostly the ancient Israelites during their semi-nomadic era before they established their own kingdom. In the book of Exodus, when the Egyptians speak about the Israelites, or when Israelites refer to themselves to other people, they frequently use the word Hebrew. But in the book of Genesis, Abraham is also called a Hebrew, and the Egyptians refer to Joseph also as a Hebrew. So at least according to the biblical accounts, before there was Israel as a people, there was a larger category of people called the Hebrews, to which not only the people of Israel, but their ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, were part of. But what or who are the Hebrews? What does the word even mean? Well, we are not certain, but to our best knowledge, the name seems to come from the Hebrew word Ivri, which means to traverse or across, and it seems to describe a people who are migrants from across the river, either the Jordan or the Euphrates. A similar word is found in other languages in the Near East, in Akkadian, which is basically ancient Babylonian, and Aramaic. So there seems to be some nomadic or migrant origin to the Israelites, as well as a very general occasion of being quote-unquote across the river. But there is yet another very similar sounding word that was used throughout the second millennium BC, so from 2000 to 1000 BC, in both the ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. And it's the Akkadian word, again Babylonian, Apiru. And that word is pronounced Apiru in Egyptian. Now again, a side note, there's a strong chance that I'm butchering all of these pronunciations, so remember that. Anyway, remember that just earlier, I mentioned that there were forces of Apiru who, along with the Shasu, were endangering the Canaanite city-states in the Levant. The word Apiru here denoted a particular social class of people who were basically landless outsiders. So they were vagabonds who were employed as mercenaries or as laborers or even enslaved, and otherwise they were shunned as outlaws or rebels or brigands. The problem is, this Apiru denoted not an ethnic group like the Israelites, but a social class or status, and recent findings indicate that this meaning of Apiru has a different etymological root from the Hebrew word for Hebrew, which again seems to denote a particular ethnic group. However, the ancient world did not distinguish ethnic groups from social class sharply as we do in our time. Certain people groups were also almost unfailingly of certain social class, though this is perhaps not so ancient if you consider what the Africans experienced in North America. Furthermore, in the book of Exodus itself, the word Hebrews, which is used to refer to Israelites, often seem to describe not an ethnic group, but a social status very much like the Apiru, vagabonds and foreigners who are enslaved because they are believed to be outlaws and rebels and lowlifes. Also, though an outsider to the field, let me raise this possible caution against discounting too readily the Apiru or the Shasu connection to ancient Israel just because they refer to a larger and seemingly different and often diverse groups of people other than the Israelites proper. See, here's an example. Up until less than 50 years ago, we used to call every indigenous people group of North and South America, again a very diverse groups of peoples, as simply Indians, a word that refers to, again, a diverse people groups that live in the Indian subcontinent in Asia, on literally the opposite side of the planet. Worse, European explorers and scholars knew that they weren't actually Indians within something like a decade of first encountering them, and yet the Europeans and Americans and Canadians and many others called them Indians for 500 more years. So how likely would an ancient superpower like Egypt call a rather insignificant group of people among its many subjects and slaves, a group, mind you, who are yet even a distinct people, let alone a nation, other than just lumping them together with other similar semi-nomadic people or even a socio-economic group often branded as slaves and outcasts? So there's my caution. But then again, on the other hand, remember that not ruling out the possibility is something very different from concluding that there really is a connection. Because all we can say is that the enslaved people described in the book of Exodus resembles the description of a number of different groups in ancient Egyptian records. The Semitic-speaking foreigners that they came to detest, the Hyksos, or the Shasu nomads, again a Semitic people, some of which are called by the mysterious name Yahu. Or even the Apiru, the landless vagabonds, sometimes employed as laborers or mercenaries, sometimes treated as outlaws and lowlifes, and sometimes subjugated and enslaved. But there just isn't enough to convince the historians today whether any of them are the people described in Exodus or whether there is any significant connection. Now, there may be a connection, but it may turn out that there isn't any. It may even be that all of them are connected somehow. After all, the enslaved Israelites described in the book of Exodus were, as a social class, very much like the Apiru, while their ancestors were very much like the Shasu, and they would have been, at least to the Egyptians, closely related to the hated Hyksos. What is significant for the story and for our understanding of it is that whoever they were marginalized ethnic minority considered as undesirable foreigners and under the rule of the most powerful empire of the time, which had both the means and the motivations to keep them under an oppressive thumb. Not unlike how ethnic minorities have been treated in many countries even today. And what the Egyptian records about the Hyksos, Shasu, and the Apiru tells us is that even if they are not the Israelites that we seek, the story of peoples oppressed, hated, and marginalized by the wider society is indeed timeless. And it is to these people that God spoke the words and promise of freedom. Have you ever heard of the Slave Bible? You can only find a few copies in existence nowadays, but it used to be the Bible that was given to the enslaved African Americans by British Christian missionaries. The catch? About 90% of the Old Testament and half of the New Testament are removed from this Bible. Out of 1,189 chapters in the Protestant version of the Christian Bible, only 232 chapters remain. Rather tellingly, the first 19 chapters from the book of Exodus are missing. The reason should be obvious. They removed every part in the Christian Bible that could, to quote a newspaper article about this Bible a few years ago, instill in slaves a dangerous hope for freedom and dreams of equality. Why would Christian missionaries go so far as literally tear apart and desecrate their own Bible and remove, among nearly 1,000 chapters out of just around 1,200, the entire first half of the book of Exodus? It's because the story of Exodus is in an important way mythical in the sense that C.S. Lewis took it. Exodus and its account of Israelites as slaves in Egypt is not merely an account of some past event and a particular ethnic people. It is a crystallization and a summary of every story of every people in every time period excluded from society as foreigners, denigrated as inferior, and treated as undesirables whose only value is as expendable labor, as slaves. It is a declaration of judgment not simply to Egypt, one particular nation or a society sometime in the distant past, but a judgment to every such society, every time it abuses its power over others. It is Egypt in the Exodus story, but it then pointed to Babylon, then to Greece, then to Rome, and even to the kingdoms of Israel and Judah themselves, as their prophets from God pronounced judgment against them for their own injustices and mistreatments of the poor, the marginalized, and the foreigners. And it was also the story of Africans kidnapped and enslaved by European powers or the American nations they set up, which is why the story had to be removed from the Slave Bible. The sheer irony of Christians desecrating their own Bible to hide what it said, to silence what God is speaking to them, is of course staggering. But their effort also proved to be entirely in vain, because that is precisely what the Christian Bible testifies. You cannot silence God. So the enslaved Africans quickly realized that what they were being taught by these missionaries were lies, and soon found the missing chapters. Spirituals or Christian hymns distinct to their community began springing up, songs of hope and the promise of deliverance and freedom spoken forth by God from the time of Exodus thousands of years ago to their own time. Then generations later, the greatest civil rights movement leaders among them, such as Martin Luther King Jr., were Christian ministers. Some of King's greatest speeches, such as "I've Been to the Mountaintop," which was also his last speech before he was assassinated, was a church sermon, and in fact, it drew on the very story of Moses in his last days. So it was in the Exodus account for the descendants of Jacob, named by God as Israel, those who wrestle with God. Oppressed, denigrated, and seemingly forgotten by God of their ancestors, they lived and endured. But God was speaking forth a new era, a time of their deliverance, to fulfill what God spoke to their ancestors personally in a promise. And so, a baby was born to a Hebrew couple. A baby during the very time the Egyptian government had commanded that every male Hebrew baby were to be thrown into the river and killed. Reality is like a speech and unfolds like a story. And a new story was now being spoken forth. But this story would be about something far more than just that of freedom and deliverance from slavery. That is just the beginning. For it will turn out that there is far more to freedom and even to slavery than what we believe, and what God speaks and beckons to such people is to a journey that will take them far beyond what they know about the world and about themselves. For the story that was now being spoken forth would require shedding away everything they hold on to regarding their world and coming face to face with what is laid bare beneath them all. So join me next episode as we follow this baby as he grows up to embark on the journey in the story that God will speak forth around him. Thank you for listening, and please follow, subscribe, and share this series with others, and rate it on your Apple Podcast and other platforms that let you do so. You can also support this series at buymeacoffee.com, which you can go to by clicking on the line Support the Show in the episode description.